it amazes me that there's still anybody that believes in the white supremacy and any sort of racial supremacy. But I am not experiencing that. I have to have empathy for the folks that do. And looking at the screen here and the people that are participating in this meeting, we're all, basically Caucasian and can pass in society pretty evenly. And we haven't had that experience of having a visible difference that's with us every day that causes people to prejudge us and actually discriminate against us at times. I've never had a store security guy follow me through, a department store. Those sort of things. So the fact that I actually made the motion to approve that resolution was important to me, because I've had plenty of friends that experienced that, but I still haven't lived that experience. And I understand the call for folks to have it recognized and called out publicly that Black Lives Matter, because there's still ignorant people out there that don't believe that. They're getting to be a smaller and smaller minority, I believe, but they're still out there. And that was important to me. It was also important that resolution was not just a declaration with no action items. It actually had action items tied to it for the county to look at our own processes and make sure that we are maintaining equal access to county services, that there's nothing built into the way we provide those services that might unintentionally create differential outcomes based on race. And I have no problem continuing to do that work. It's work we already do. So it was very important to me that resolution, be done, that our voice is there supporting that community. And it doesn't support the violence. It doesn't support any sort of, holding Black lives up higher than white lives. It wasn't anti-police. But what it did do was empathize and recognize what Black people have to live with every day. And that was important to me and personal to me in a lot of ways. And I could recount, and I did a little bit in my statement, some of the issues I've dealt with over the years. But that was really important to me. On the other hand, later in the afternoon, the same day that we passed this resolution, we had a budget hearing. And apparently somebody that's an activist in the actual Black Lives movement must have put something out on the internet that we were having that hearing and encouraged people to call in and ask us to defund the police. Now, interesting enough, they didn't give the folks calling in any background on who they were calling into, apparently, and what budget we controlled, because we had multiple callers that called in and asked us to reduce the Eugene Police Department's budget by 30% and give that money to cahoots. And after all the public testimony was over with, Chair Buck brought some staff on to explain that this is the Lane County Board of Commissioners budget, and it's the Eugene City Council that controls the budget for Eugene Police Department. So it was sad and funny at the same time, because I could tell from the voice that most of these people calling in were, young people under 30, if not down into their teenage years. And they're just so misinformed. And what's interesting is, they're supporting cahoots. And what they don't understand is that that mobile mental health response that Cahoots does, which is a great thing because there's a lot of times where it's better off to have a mental health and an EMT person respond than a cop to somebody that's screaming at no one at all on a street corner, and the imaginary person that's with them. It's a good thing, but the Cahoots model works because they have police backup. And it worked so well that Lane County several years ago in a past budget 3 or 4 years ago, increased the amount of money we were putting in the Cahoots program so they could go to a second van and second crew. And it's something that's not just Lane County that supports, it's City of Eugene, it's City of Springfield, and I even think the City of Veneta tips in some money so they can come out to Veneta if needed. So it's a great model, but the model doesn't work without police. And just to demonstrate that, we started a pilot program out in Western Lane County with the Siuslaw Valley Fire District, where they are doing mobile mental health crisis response. And the phase 1 of it was to be inside the city of Florence, and we want to expand it phase 2 out towards Mapleton and Deadwood and those areas. We can't do it because we don't have police backup when they leave the city of Florence. It works in Florence because the Florence PD is there to back them up. Because sometimes when you're dealing with somebody in complete acute mental health crisis like these crews do, it gets beyond their ability to control, and they need help. And that's really, it amazes me that people were testifying yesterday to cut the staff of the very department that backs up the thing they wanted to expand. That little knowledge was involved in those folks. And then they were just basically asking us to cut the jail or to cut any public safety. And why did we spend so much of our general fund on public safety? And I don't think they understand that public safety isn't what it used to be, particularly here in Oregon. I've spoken to you all about this in the past, but Lane County and the state of Oregon are leaders in the concept of restorative justice. It's something that, that you hear a term thrown around a lot, but basically it means we're not about using our criminal justice system just to punish people. Our criminal justice system is being revamped to get people that were criminal and restore them to being good citizens. So the objective is not just to punish, it's also to, fix why are these people criminogenic in the first place. So we have things like our treatment court program, which all the grants go through our Lane County Sheriff's Office, so that shows up as dollars for the Sheriff's Office in our budget. But our treatment court diverts people from our prison system, takes people charged with felonies, usually property crime felonies that are being done to support a drug habit, depending on which treatment court you're talking about. We also have a veterans court and a mental health court, but most of our treatment courts involve people addicted with drugs, and gives them an opportunity. We'll take you through court, get you sentenced and send you to prison, or we can divert you pre-trial to go through this program. And if you succeed, we'll drop those charges. And that program has been massively successful. And I would encourage anybody to contact our treatment court and ask them when the next graduation is, because they'll let you come sit in the audience during a graduation and listen to what the participants have to say and the families of the participants have to say about how that saved their life. And then the families talk about how they got their dad back, or how they got their son back, or their husband or wife back. It is incredible what that does to change people's lives. But that's in our public safety budget. You know, so when you start talking about defund, you know, you're throwing the, you know, a lot out. You know, if you want to, you know, you're actually defunding. Treatment court doesn't just include, you know, the court that's being funded. It includes the emergence drug treatment that goes to those folks. It includes all the, you know, the therapy and skills training. And my poodle. This is one thing about Zoom meetings. I don't control. Oh, I may have to pause for a second here just because what we have bring your dog to work out here, and my employee's dog came in, and my other dog will not stop barking as long as she's in here. So excuse me. Louie, come on. Come on, Layla. My apologies. And that's Zoom. But there's so much nonprofits and social service that actually gets funded out of our public safety because it's part of that restorative justice. There are other pieces like our medical care in the jail that where we've actually upped the amount of mental health professionals that are actually dedicated and stationed in our jail to do assessments and help, you know, get folks back onto their meds or keep them on their meds and deal with the number, because it's somewhere about 60% of our jail inmates have a mental health issue, you know, to deal with that. That's in the sheriff's budget too, those mental health providers. Our pretrial services that we do that we're very aggressive about, that as we book somebody, we actually have them meet with pretrial folks and assess their risk and try and, quite often, rather than book them directly into jail, we'll release, you know, with bail or even just on own recognizance, depending on risk, so that they don't end up losing a job because they spent a couple nights in jail and they don't, and, you know, so there's not other things that happen that make it much harder to recover their lives. But there's just so many different pieces of this restorative justice we do, whether it's on the front end like that or on the back end where we're actually taking people out of prison early under our RLAN program, which just stands for Release Lane. And it was helping the state out to prevent them from going over the limits on the women's prison capacity. And now we take, you know, both sexes out early by several months, but they stay in our community corrections facility first, and then they get moved down basically to the sponsors' facilities and get reintegrated. The recidivism rate for that program is minuscule. You'd be amazed how well people do reintegrating when they go through that step down, coached and counseled reintegration with through that program, which means part of the sheriff's budget goes to sponsors. You know, one of those social service providers that provides that post-prison, post-incarceration reintegration work and does amazing work. So all through this, you look at what we spend in our youth services department, and I know Craig's on the phone here, and they've been benefits in the past of our youth services where they actually provide some of the treatment involved in that. And I know OHA uses Craig. So quite often, I don't think some of these people that are calling for defund understand everything involved in our public safety system, how integrated it's become, and how we utilize that system to reconnect people with services, get them back on OHA, get them back on their meds, you know, try and get them into housing somewhere if they're homeless. And the other places we've committed in our budget, you know, with our Housing First model and other efforts to try and get people off the street, fix why they're on the street in the first place, and that gets them away from the criminal justice system. Our Fuse pilot program showed a huge reduction in arrests for the folks that we put into that Housing First model. So it's just, it gets me a little bit when people talk about this, and it just amazes me too when we get lumped in with everybody else. Because I was speaking with the sheriff this morning because we had a little incident out in my district out there, a place called Swamp Creek Farm, which I'm sure that Steve Brock and a few others are familiar with out there at 126 and Poodle Creek Road. They had SWAT team out there yesterday serving a search warrant on somebody that was suspected of being a felon in possession of a firearm. Now, if you're familiar with that site, it's a bunch of shacks and cars and campers that people are living in, scattered about, several acres. Not exactly a safe entry for law enforcement. So they show up in their big surplus military vehicle, which they got for free and is being maintained for free by the National Guard as part of their training, and use the loudspeaker to ask people to come out, thereby never putting law enforcement in danger. Even if somebody had come out of one of those shacks firing, they can just sit back and wait, And it was the ability to sit behind that armor that made that a safe, search of that site. And, after they got everybody out and everything was safe, they went through and searched. They found over a dozen firearms in those various dwellings, including a loaded firearm with the safety off in a space where children were sleeping, along with a baggie of meth. So this was not a bunch of good people necessarily. 4 arrests were made, but that sort of, that piece of equipment is exactly what they're saying we need to take away from our police, when it's that piece of equipment that prevents the no-knock search warrant, where the only other option, if you can't sit behind armor, is to come in the middle of the night and try and surprise people. And that usually doesn't work out real well. And we don't do that here in Lane County. And what's really interesting about our sheriff's office is all of our deputies start in a jail. We don't take any trainee deputies and take them straight out to the street. So they spend usually several years before transferring into patrol and moving up through patrol, dealing in 8-hour shifts of communicating with inmates and trying to get them to be compliant and everything before they ever hit the street. And we are really strict in our screening process about our deputies. We take less than 5% of our applicants into training for the sheriff's office, and we were in the very first wave and one of the first agencies to sign up for the FBI's use of force database. We've always been a very strong reporter of use of force, and very strong about disciplining folks that abuse use of force and disciplining other officers and supervisors for failing to stop poor use of force. So I hate the way law enforcement, at least in this movement, sometimes is being peanut buttered and painted as this, the guy that knelt on somebody's neck long enough to kill him. That's not typical. And one of the things I mentioned in my statement is there's over 800,000 law enforcement professionals in this country. Can you imagine the millions of contacts with citizens a year that those 800,000 people do? I mean, just think about even Lane County, and between EPD, SPD, LCSO, Junction City, Florence, Cottage Grove, all the various police agencies, how many hundreds of thousands of contacts with citizens do they have a year? And how often do we hear about excessive use of force in our community? It's a rare thing. It's not the norm. It's the rare thing. So that's one of the things I want to stress with this. So I've been blabbing on here for about 30 minutes or so, including dog interruptions. And I think I've thrown a bit of red meat out there between Black Lives Matter and and all lives matter, and the need to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter and why I believe that, to restorative justice and what defund would really mean. So I'll stop now and take questions. And Steve, are you watching hand raising and stuff like that?
Well, we just kind of try to be polite with each other, and everybody is muted right now, and then when you want to talk, you unmute yourself, and then it kind of works. But if it gets too radical, we'll go with the hand raising. But I have a question about what you're saying. I don't think, in my opinion, I don't think anybody is opposed, or I don't know anybody opposed to having people acknowledge that Black lives do matter, or anybody's lives matter. But what bothers me is when this turns from a horrible thing with George Floyd, which was indefensible, into a riot and looting, and the whole thing was lost. His death, in my opinion, was kind of lost in all of the violence that's going against, even against people, other people who are African Americans or Black or whatever I'm supposed to call them these days. It's just, I don't get it. Anyway, I'm sorry, I get, but would you comment on that, please?
Yeah, and I think I want to make a distinction between the peaceful protests that have been around the George Floyd incident and how horrible that incident was. Just like you said, I don't think there's anyone that's seen that video that thought that officer was doing the right thing. And I don't care how much somebody's resisting arrest. At that point, you've got fellow officers, and unfortunately, a couple guys had only been on the street a couple days, going, "Don't you think we should turn them over?" And things like that. But they're kind of letting the senior officer that's a veteran handle the situation. That was horrible, and the peaceful protest around that, or I can understand, because for some of those people, in particular the people that have been living that daily issue of being discriminated against and prejudged based on their skin color, it was just a triggering event. But unfortunately, some people chose to take that event, just like the celebrations around winning the NBA title in certain cities has caused riots. There are people that will take advantage of a situation when there's a large enough gathering of people that outnumber the police and use that to do violence. And I don't think that was the intent of the original protests. I don't think they were intending to go violent. I think there were certain folks that just have a tendency to do that, and I also think there were some activists that wanted it to go that direction. So I hope folks can separate a little bit. And I do know that there have been people that have denounced the violence that are in the movement. And I've even heard, like you're saying, I remember the one woman that was basically crying about the fact that she lost the only place she can shop because the bus lines were shut down. I don't know if you saw that video and that news story. In Minneapolis, they apparently, looted and burned the local little shop. And because of COVID, the bus system's not working, and this woman, that was the only place within walking distance of her apartment, and now she has no place to get food, for her and her family. And she was, bawling on the street to the reporter about that. That, and she was a Black woman, so it wasn't that they're hurting them own selves sometimes. But I don't think, just like we believe that not all cops will kneel on somebody's neck for 8 minutes, I don't believe everyone involved in objecting to that behavior by the officer are willing to go out and damage businesses. And I think here in Eugene, it was a case of taking advantage of a situation on that Friday night where they just outnumbered the cops. The cops were actually mentally preparing for Sunday when the actual real rally was called for, and were just outmanned at the time, and had to sit back and wait till they could get enough reserves called in from other departments and from shifts that, you know, they had to pull people in on overtime to eventually deal with that situation that Friday night. But I don't think that those folks that were doing the looting Friday night was the same crowd that showed up to the federal courthouse on Sunday in mass. In fact, they were greatly outnumbered by the folks that showed up and protested peacefully compared to the several hundred that decided they were going to, you know, damage the Five Guys and the Starbucks there. So it's angering in some ways, but I think it's an object lesson that we can kind of point to people and remind them about what Dr. King said about violence begets violence, and it does not solve anything. It, you know, as he said, you know, you can kill the hater, but the hate will go on, you know, with violence. You know, the only thing that can get rid of hate is love. You know, so, you know, he was very clear about that. And I think it's an opportunity for us to kind of remind people of Dr. King's words and ask them to be nonviolent and praise the people that are. You know, even if they stop traffic, which we know is not technically legal, but it's a form of civil disobedience versus destruction and criminal behavior. You know, you have to support people's right to at least do civil disobedience. They might get arrested for it eventually, you know, but you know, at least they're doing some kind of peaceful protest, and we should support their right to peaceful protest.
Well, thank you. Anybody else have any questions? I've muted everybody, so if you want to make
hey, Steve,
Yes.
this is Sid. Hey, Jay, how you doing?
Hey, Sid, good to see you.
You too. Jay and I have been texting for the last, well, since I've been out of the office, so almost the last 2 years. So, Jay, one of the things, and I sent you a text this week, and maybe just to hear your thoughts on it as well. But so I've been communicating quite a bit with some friends of mine back in DC, some lobbyists, where we got a groundswell starting to happen. I think you'll see it more coming out maybe this summer. But Eric Chauvin, the officer who has now been charged with second-degree murder, during his career, he has had 17 complaints against him. He was involved 3 officer-involved shootings, which included 1 death. And during that time, only 1 disciplinary action was against him. And one of the things that we've been talking about is this unbelievable power that the public employee unions have and in protecting their own. And I think this is what you basically saw with this officer. I mean, I'm going to tell you now, if he was in the private sector, he'd probably been fired 10 years ago, a minimum. But unfortunately, he's completely protected. And so maybe if you could comment on that, because I think that's one of the things that is not being discussed at all, is the fact that, like you said, and I completely agree with you, 98% of all the officers in this country are good and they do their jobs well. Unfortunately, you have that small minority of bad apples. And I'm sorry, but 17 complaints in a 20-year career, that tells me he's been a bad apple for a bit and yet was completely protected. And one other thing I'll mention real quickly is the chief of police in Minneapolis has called off further negotiations with the police union until they can start talking about this very, very issue about how you go about, you know, if there's complaints, then things need to be taken care of right then and there. So if you could comment on that as well. And I'm saying that because Jay is actually probably as seasoned as well as anybody when it comes to contract negotiations with our unions, as I got to sit in with him for 8 years on this, and Jay is probably as good as anybody I've ever been around on this. So Jay, if you could comment, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sid, and thanks for bringing up that issue, because it is an issue. Fortunately, our local for the Sheriff's Office, Lane County Peace Officers Association, LCPOA. They've been really good to work with about disciplinary actions. And in fact, one of the things the sheriff was sharing with me is, it's not only about making sure we call people out when they've done use of force beyond what's recommended, but the failure to discipline by command staff needs to be taken into account. And that's actually happened in the Sheriff's Department before. There's actually been a lieutenant and a captain that have been reprimanded for failing to discipline somebody for excessive force. So it kind of goes both ways too. You can't have the brotherhood, so to speak, where people are going to have your back. You got to make sure that everybody's holding to it. But we've got a pretty strong relationship between management and the union here in our Sheriff's Department, but that is not true all over the country. And the one thing I will say is Oregon's Public Employee Collective Bargaining Act, which is known as PECBA, which you'll hear, us guys like Sid and I, PECBA was second, was something we knew everybody was talking about when we mentioned PECBA. But that Collective Bargaining Act and subsequent statutory work that the legislature does and continues to do has tilted the scales in favor of the unions so far. I cannot just tell you how far in that direction it's gone. And it is very difficult to discipline sometimes a union member. Sid was there when we had members of a certain union basically take some county equipment and sell it for scrap, and which is theft, and were fired because of it, having to be rehired. Mm-hmm. Because the union objected to how their dismissal was handled, and after going through the various processes with the state labor relations board, we were forced to rehire those employees. So just to give you an idea of how far that's tilted. Fortunately, I think this particular incident and other incidents is going to bring to light. And that's kind of where I get to the part of the action parts of the board order. Where in our system can our system actually hide racism and create conditions for racism to exist? If we have the inability to discipline people for doing things that are racist or violent, that's part of that system. And I think the calls for everybody to look for that, quote, systemic racism, that's going to call into question this whole relationship and ability to shield through unions bad actors. And I guarantee you that all the good cops hate the bad cops, because they get look what's happened. They're getting stained over this one idiot in Minneapolis. They don't like that. And I think they would probably tell you they don't want their unions to protect people like that, but there's just this sort of obligation to, that's what unions are there for in some ways, is to protect the employees and represent them. And I think they're people that learn as union members to manipulate that system to protect their own bad behavior. I'm sure you guys have had coworkers and all that knew just how to live right on the edge. The 35-minute lunch instead of the 30-minute lunch, the 20-minute break instead of the 15-minute break, or whatever it is they were doing, showing up 3 minutes late and getting out the door 3 minutes early. There are people like that everywhere, because humans are flawed. And there's people that will use the system. And I think Sid's pointing to something where the system now is set up in a way that it's too easily used by a bad actor to protect himself.
Jay, this is Darlene. I was a federal employee And in my career, I've fired 2 federal employees. And the last one went all the way up in, I had to go testify back. This was when I was in Germany. So after I came back to the States, she kept appealing this until we had federal court in Alexandria, Virginia. And she was using EEO. This is a white woman, but she was using age discrimination and everything else. So, and the amount of time that I had to invest in keeping book on her and documenting everything, I can understand why some supervisors are so busy in the police department that to start to keep all this book and documentation on everybody, it takes away so much from the job you're supposed to be doing. So I mean, I understand, you know, I wasn't even dealing with a union, but it is difficult to fire somebody. After I got through with the court hearing back in Washington, D.C., or for Alexandria, and we did win, the government did win, the attorney said, did you learn anything? And at that time I was working in Texas. And I said, yes, I'm going back to Texas, and I'm going to tell that young lady that works for me, I'm never going through this again. It was a horrible experience just to fire somebody.
Yeah, yeah. And even with good cause, it can get really tied up. You know, the other example that actually made the news with a union employee at Lane County was we had somebody that was found to be under the influence of marijuana at work. And we are, you know, we accept federal money, so we have to be drug-free workplace and all that stuff. Let him go, and we ended up having to hire him back after the union objected. Because, quote, it was medical, but of course never informed us and all this stuff. And it was just, yeah. You know, he was asked to take a drug test after, you know, falling asleep in a group meeting. So,
this is John Quilter.
Hey, John.
I would like to shift gears to a different subject.
Sure.
I'm concerned also about the business climate here in Lane County and greater Willamette Valley. And I came from a state that was host to dozens of Fortune 500 large corporations that drove the economy and provided careers, not just mere jobs. With the diminution of logging, why aren't we replacing that? Growing grass seed, hazelnuts, and microbreweries is just not going to cut it. Tesla, I read today, wants to gear up to produce electric 18-wheelers. Are we even in the game for encouraging them to maybe consider Oregon as a site for that kind of a production facility?
My guess is no, and I'll give you a 3-word answer as to why. Corporate activity tax. You know, we have made our state unfriendly in our tax system. You know, when you have a corporate activity tax, you're basically, it's a value-added tax along the entire supply chain. You move a company in here, and it's charged against your total revenues. You know, so who in their right mind is going to set a company up in Oregon versus Tennessee that has a very good, you know, good tax structure for corporations. So it's, you know, beyond that, at the same time, you know, we have a fairly high income tax. We have a corporate activities tax now, and our legislature's been trying to push through a carbon taxing structure. You know, I cannot see us competing with any other state and locality to attract outside corporations to locate and start a factory here. You know, the one thing I can see us doing is maybe getting our logging back up and and expanding that that industry at some scale, because we have a massive amount of fiber that is, is overcrowded in our federal forests that we could be harvesting. And if there's a little bit of change, and we just got a new BLM administrator for Washington and Oregon, so we'll see if some of that starts changing. But that's, if we're not doing it from internal, I can't see how we're going to attract people externally when we have to compete with the Tennessees, the Texases, Indianas, and other states that just are so much better set up tax-wise.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any more questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm sure many of us probably watched what happened in the Capitol Hill area of Seattle last night. I'd like to know if local officials in our area have discussed what the local response would be if the same type of lawlessness were to happen here. And apparently the National Guard wouldn't be available if the governor had anything to do with it. How would we protect the publicly owned buildings in Eugene, Springfield, like county and federal courthouse, city halls, city and county jails? In my opinion, losing those buildings would be catastrophic to our existence. Can you comment on that?
This is where it'd probably be better to have the sheriff in here answering some of those questions. But also, I have a feeling that whatever their plans are probably not for public consumption. You don't really reveal to the enemy what's going on. But it is a concern, because we harbor some of the same sort of activists that exist in Seattle. I mean, the anarchist movement started in Eugene and moved to Seattle. It didn't start in Seattle and move to Eugene.
True.
So it is a little scary to think about. I think I hope that we will not be a target of that sort of attempted takeover, because we're just not big enough to make national news, and that's what they're after. They were after the news stories, and just the kind of showing the muscle and proving a point sort of thing. But yeah, it's a little scary. It's one of the things that as you do emergency planning, we all think about floods and God forbid Cascadia subduction zone earthquake and how bad that's going to be. All those natural disasters, at least you have some idea of what you're going to be dealing with, the damage, the injuries, etc. And there, lots of plans you can do with dealing with mobs, and mob rule is so difficult to do any planning for. And yeah, Cascadia is not going to have, we're not going to get a lot of warning for it and all that, other than we know it's going to happen sometime soon and we're overdue. But usually flooding, we have a couple days of prep, from weather forecasting, or, wildfires, we get, they usually don't turn into a, conflagration overnight. So a lot of that stuff, but the instantaneous takeover of several blocks of a town, that they've managed to, utilize, communications that are decentralized and non-traceable and are outside the intelligence gathering operations of law enforcement. How do you prep for that? And what's the next thing? What are they going to do next? And that's what happened that Friday night. They basically took advantage of the fact that there wasn't enough staffing available at that time to stop a riot, and went right ahead and did it, knowing that, the options to EPD at that time were to try and intervene without enough manpower, which usually means you end up use of force, and high use of force. Because if you're going to try and control a crowd with not enough people, you're going to control it with force, which either leads to officers getting injured or the rioters getting injured, which is what I think they wanted in some ways. They wanted their own George Floyd incident here in Eugene. So Yeah, it keeps me up at night thinking about controlling people versus responding to natural disasters.